Buddhism is a world religion founded by the Buddha in ancient India. Buddhists seek wisdom, meaning, inner peace, and freedom from greed, hatred, and ignorance. Mutually sustaining life, a Buddhist call to a troubled world.
Because it recognizes the mutual relationship of every being, it accounts for the gratitude that arises from the realization of this interdependency. It produces the volunteer spirit to repay these invisible obligations.
This show is the last in the series of 4 shows on how and why Buddhism has been growing in America. Today, we would like to explore one of the interesting characteristics of American Buddhism, what is being called engaged Buddhism. Engaged Buddhism refers to the effort to apply the teachings to address social issues and problems in order to build a more equitable and peaceful world. This emphasis on the outer and the social differs from the traditional Buddhism that has emphasized the inner and the mental. Before we begin with our main topic, let me briefly mention some of the other distinctive characteristics of American Buddhism. First, there are definitely more women in leadership roles, as they make up half of the teachers in some of the convert groups. As discussed earlier, women helped to found the Insight Meditation Society, and women now hold top leadership positions at San Francisco Zen Center and elsewhere. Secondly, monks and nuns are the norm in the Buddhist world in Asia, but American Buddhists have largely rejected celibacy in favor of married priests or priests in long-term relationships. Thirdly, psychology and psychotherapy have proven to be one of the channels through which Buddhism is being understood and adopted by many Americans. The reasons are due to the obvious similarities in their focus on the mind and inner workings. Finally, the American love of humor has also impacted the Buddhist world. For instance, I heard a Buddhist joke even on a mainstream radio station. Why couldn't the Buddha vacuum under a sofa? Well, the answer is, are you ready? Because he had no attachments. Well, I think it's pretty good, and if you don't get it, please keep watching this program as I will explain it in due course. Today, I'm pleased to have with us a guest to help throw greater light on the topic of engaged Buddhism. Our guest is Professor David Loy, who has written extensively and lectured worldwide on Buddhist philosophy, especially as they apply to social issues of the day. David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ken. It's my pleasure to be here.
Good. Let me begin by asking a question about how you got started in Buddhism and when.
Well, I was part of a large wave of young Americans who became Buddhists in the late 60s and early 70s. I think it was a natural development out of the cultural transformation that occurred then, not only politically, but also spiritually. I think many of us became open to new possibilities. And for me personally, as a philosophy major in college, it wasn't such a big jump from existential philosophy to something like Buddhism, which, as you know, is a very existential religion. It has a lot to say about death,
Right.
meaning of life, and anxiety, such things.
I know you've written a number of books, and I wonder if you can say a few words about some of the books that you've written on, specifically on engaged Buddhism.
Thanks for the plug.
You're welcome.
There are two main books. One of them is historical, and it tries to use Buddhist principles to look at how it was that the history of the West developed in the way that it did. The title of that one is A Buddhist History of the West. It doesn't talk about Buddhism in the West, but it uses Buddhist ideas.
I see. Yeah.
And the other one is more recent. That one is called The Great Awakening, A Buddhist Social Theory. And that, again, tries to elaborate Buddhist principles into a social understanding. As you know, Buddhism doesn't really have a social theory, but we can extrapolate from the basic Buddhist teachings to look at social issues and social problems, and that's what that book tries to do.
I see. Well, on that point about Buddhism lacking social philosophy, that there are some people who claim that Buddhism should not be so concerned with the social, rather it should be focused more on the inner and the mental. How do you respond to that?
I think that's a very good question because, of course, many people do think that way. But the really important response is, can we really separate them? Can we separate the personal from the social? In fact, you could argue that it's really inconsistent with basic Buddhist teachings to try to do that. As you know, Buddhism is all about awakening, awakening to our true nature, and awakening involves overcoming this sense of duality between inside and outside, this sense of separation that I'm in here and the world is out there. Buddhism emphasizes the interdependence of everything, that there's no self apart from the world. So the danger then is if we're thinking that we're just looking after our own liberation, our own awakening, then we're really reinforcing in our practice what we're trying to overcome.
Right. Let me ask you, are there organizations that are specifically dedicated to socially engaged Buddhism?
Yes, there are quite a few now. The two that I'm most familiar with are, first, the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, which is based in Bangkok, Thailand. It's primarily an Asian organization, so it has branches in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. But the main group for Americans is the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, which is based in Berkeley, California. It started about 25 years ago, and it's an umbrella group encompassing all different types of Buddhism. In fact, you don't even have to be a Buddhist to be involved, as long as you're committed to the same basic principles of peace and justice that they're concerned about.
Can I ask you more specifically, what are some of the issues? Environment, these.
Well, as you can imagine, peace and justice issues are a very important part of their work, especially in the last few years, dealing with things like Afghanistan, Iraq, and terrorism. They've also been very involved with matters working with prison groups. There's a lot of people, there are a lot of Buddhists, for example, now in prisons. We have a very huge prison system in the United States. They do a lot with homelessness and other issues of poverty, and they also try to address other peace and justice issues like gender and racism. So it's really dealing with a large number of issues. In addition to all that, they're trying to develop social analysis from a Buddhist perspective that would help us understand these problems.
Fascinating. One of the recent concerns, of course, is the Iraq War, and I know you've written extensively and have spoken widely in different parts of the world. Could we hear a little bit about your thoughts on Iraq?
Well, as you can imagine, Buddhism and the Buddha had a great deal to say about issues of peace, nonviolence, and hatred. One of the most interesting and important things he said was that hatred is never ended by hatred. Hatred, the original term is vera, is always ended by non-hatred, often translated as love or compassion. Now, the interesting question for us today is, if that's true personally, And the Buddha said 2,500 years ago that this was an ancient law. If that's true personally, is it also true collectively? Can't we see that operating in Iraq right now? It's a sad thought, but the truth is the United States now is probably more disliked and in many quarters more hated as a result of our very military response to terrorism than we were 3 years ago, before September 11th. It seems to be exemplifying what the Buddha was getting at, that when your response to terrorism is killing terrorists, you can't be surprised that others are springing up out of the network in response to that.
David, is there a final point you'd like to make?
Buddhism is all about suffering and how to end our suffering. Traditionally, this was understood in a very personal way. How do I address my own greed, my own ill will, and my own delusion? Again, these three roots of evil. But the situation we find ourselves in now is quite different, I think. We have to find ways to address the institutional forms of these three poisons. We're in a situation now where we have institutionalized greed, institutionalized ill will, and institutionalized delusion. And that's really the koan, that's really the challenge for contemporary Buddhism. Can we understand how to address them as well as our own personal problems?
Well, thank you, David, for sharing your thoughts and insights with us.
Thank you, Ken.
Obviously, in Buddhism, there is no one position that all Buddhists must adhere to on social matters. Each person must arrive at his or her own opinion. What is fascinating, however, is that on the American soil, we are witnessing a blossoming of the social dimension of Buddhism in what is called engaged Buddhism. However, this spirit is not an American invention, for it goes to the very heart of Buddhist spirituality, which was expressed in today's opening passage. Because it recognizes the mutual relationship of every being, it accounts for the gratitude that arises from the realization of this interdependency. It produces the volunteer spirit to repay these invisible obligations. In our next series of shows, we will move away from the topic of American Buddhism and take a look back to the beginning of Buddhism in ancient India as we explore the life and the teachings of the Buddha.
We at Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai pursue peace and happiness for people around the world. We have published the Buddhist teachings into 41 languages and donated our publication to hotels and other facilities in 55 countries. We would like to share the Buddhist teachings with people around the world. That's our mission. Visit our website for more information.